Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about my contribution to the book, which is a chapter titled Collectivity and Privacy in Housing. Let me start with a quote from the journalist, editor, anarchist, housing campaigner Colin Ward from a few decades ago. And it goes like this. He said, "Our assumptions about the nature of urban living have been shriveled down to the quick buck culture of the property development industry. And it is left to the disinherited young to protest against the loss of the stimulus of a little confusion." And the point of departure of this chapter is the interest of a younger generation of Generation Z, young millennials, in collective housing in different forms. Um, Over the last decade, it has gained traction. Here's a quote from a journal called the Journal of Property Management from Chicago from a few years ago. They wrote, "As rents soar in many desirable markets, younger renters are proving they are willing to upend the old find a roommate on Craigslist model that has served millions in years past. Older mainstream apartment developers are now rushing to cash in on the trend. Co-living is already disrupting Chicago rental markets." Now, of course, this was noticed very much in architecture, and architecture students have been very much on top of this game. But the question I'm asking here is really how to understand this. Is it a profound change in values, or is it more of a sticking plaster, a coping mechanism to deal with the crisis in housing, with rising rents and so on, or is it something more significant, more profound, and perhaps with longer longevity, right? And what I do in this chapter is provide a kind of concise history of privacy and collectivity in housing, with the emphasis of how privacy is itself related to modernity, right? And here's a quote from Robin Evans, who wrote about this as well, right? He wrote that the search for privacy, comfort, and independence through the agency of architecture is quite recent. And even when these words first came into play and were used in relation to household affairs, their meanings were quite different from those we now understand. And of course, housing itself is a recent category in architecture. Until the 19th century, majority of housing was done by craftspeople, not by these professionals, the professional class of architects that began emerging in northern Italy in Renaissance, right? The ones who draw rather than build. But in the 19th century, especially when mass housing commissions began, and initially they began without architects, but then they began calling in architects to assist in this. This changed. It meant that for architecture, the vast majority of buildings in the city were part of what architects produce, not just the public buildings, the grand palaces, and so on. So housing as a category is relatively new in architecture, and the question of dwelling and privacy feature here quite significantly. So the story I tell is conceived of three main threads. The first one looks at the villa and how the villa and the rise of the villa is connected to the rise of bourgeoisie. First of all, the rich traders, later the capitalists, and so on, and their attempt to emulate their social superiors, right, aristocracy. But it's also about change in organization of the villa, spatial organization, with a change from, let's say, thoroughfare rooms to terminal rooms with more privacy. So how privacy was brought into the villa to a layout which became a layout we are familiar from all flats, from all housing today. So the rise of villa to be the prominent, or as Misha Muller and Reinhardt said, the hegemonic typology of the villa. Another strand looks at the slum. A slum, 19th century slum in the industrialized European cities, very much as a form of collective living. A lot of it, of course, not out of choice. We're talking about the overcrowding of homes where you had multiple families in a single home, or even sometimes sharing rooms, and the ill effects of this. But we're also talking about forms of mutual aid, how somebody would take care of a neighbor's kids when they went to work, or maybe there were warnings about police raids and so on. So it was a real experience of collective form of living. And one of the reasons that the idea of a villa was not an ideal to the 19th century working class. And the third thread looks into this grander project, if you like, of integrating the working class to prevent revolution, in which housing played a major role. And it starts with the model housing of the 1840s, which were modeled, of course, on the homes of the social superiors of the middle class. And what this actually meant is the emphasis on privacy was brought into these homes, and the working class were made to live not collectively but privately. And this process, of course, leads us to where we are today. And finally, you could say, ends with Thatcher's right to buy, where through home ownership, the working class was expected to become middle class, right? And a revolution to be finally overcome. Thank you.